Not on mute now.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to our first hour of power this season. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and I send that respect to the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. Our subject today is Berkeley Mixing, and our speaker this evening is Dave Young. Dave has been part of the GB rowing team a while back, and part of the English Institute of Sport before he saw the light and came across to Australia. He's a senior high performance coach for the women's NTC and also NSWIS, and has an extremely large amount of knowledge and experience in this subject. So I think he knows what it takes to actually move a rowing boat. So no further ado, I'll pass across to you, Dave.
Thanks, AB. I'll just make sure I'm on screen. So just give people online an idea. We've got about 7-8 people in the room, and then we've got I think a few more people rolling in online. Just can I get a thumbs up from someone just to make sure they can hear me fine and everything sounds good? Yeah, all good? Okay. Right, so AB asked me to present. I've done a few presentations over the years for Rowing New South Wales. And I've always been a bit concerned about pitching it too heavy and going over the heads of some people. So I've tried to change the presentation a little bit this time, and I've put the emphasis on the school rower, but I think it will be applicable to masters rowers too. And yeah, there's some technical stuff towards the end, but hopefully it'll be of interest. Okay. Sorry, just a technical issue here. Okay, so if we just, if I start off with the rowing basics and what we kind of know, it's pretty standard kind. I'm going to have to dive forward and touch the cursor every now and then. We know it's 2K race, certainly for the elite level and the school age level. World best times are between 5:18 and 7:08, and we also know that in a lot of conditions it can be a lot longer than that, and for school age rowers can be a lot longer than that. And it takes about 240 strokes to get down the course at the elite level, and obviously more at lower level. So what we kind of know is it's an aerobic event, right? So even though we're going to talk about strength and power today, we know the aerobic system. It's very important. Just give you a thumbs up. Yeah. So we know it's about 80 to 85% aerobic, and anaerobic lactic system about 10 to 15%, and anaerobic alactic system 4 to 4.5%, which would be mainly around the start and maybe a sprint for the finish. And I guess the key thing I want to get across here is boat speed. You tap on there, Marcus. Boat speed is a product of distance per stroke and stroke rate. And I guess if early in my career, I had I worked with the British rowing team, and I worked with these guys here on the coach on the left of the screen. There is a guy called Darren Whiter, who I think that's a picture of him now. He didn't look quite like that grey 15 years ago, but he was someone I really enjoyed working with. He really educated me in the sport of rowing, and I was fortunate enough to work with these two guys here, Zach Purchase and Mark Hunter. And in 2007, the crew we all won a bronze medal at the World Championships, the lightweight double, and the Danish guys on the left there won the gold, and the French were second. And Darren sat me down at the beginning of our training for the year into the Beijing Olympics, and basically made me watch the whole race. And at the end of the race, he was like, "What did you see?" And I was a bit like, "Well, you know, the Danes won by about a length and a half. The French looked a bit ragged." He's like, "Don't worry about the French. We've got them covered. We'll beat them next year. But what about the Danes?" And I don't know. What was I supposed to see? He goes, "Well, they won by 2 seconds, but we took 15 more strokes during the course of the race." And he goes, "We just need to get more distance per stroke if we're going to be competitive with these guys." And the good thing was we were, and we won a gold medal the following year. But we actually put in a plan around the lightweight rowers that was, so I don't know whether to look at the camera and you guys. The plan was actually we went 4 strength sessions a week with 2 lightweight guys, and one of them actually really struggled with weight a little bit. So it was a courageous decision by the coach to take that approach. But we fixed that problem. We got that a little bit more distance per stroke. We went a bit faster, and they won a gold medal that year. And I think that year they also won like World Rowing Crew of the Year as well. So we're going to focus a lot on today's session on what I think we can do as a strength and conditioning coach or a coach to impact distance per stroke, because I think that's our main bang for our buck when we're talking about making rowing faster. So can we go back, actually? Go back. So I think people would normally expect me to start off and how we're going to get more distance to stroke around the development of power. But I'm just going to start off talking about stroke length, because my philosophy around developing a school age rower is there's lots of different ways we can improve. Come on, John. Come on. That's all right. Come on. There's lots of different ways we can impact distance per stroke, and it doesn't have to be lifting massive weights right from the start. So the first thing is stroke length. So if we can get greater stroke length, we can actually take it back again. Yeah, sorry. Can propel the boat around the blade further. It gives more opportunity because the length and the movements further gives us more opportunity to apply power to the sort of blade and onto the boat. And to get into those good positions, we can develop physical qualities that will transfer, which is obviously mobility. So we need to be flexible. We have to be able to get into deep levels of flexion of the catch around our hips, and hips and ankle in particular, thoracic spine as well. And we need to be stable and strong, so when we're in those positions, we're not sort of losing energy and letting the seat slide, or losing position, or just not transferring it across. So we can start off by starting to impact distance per stroke by running through a greater range. And to do that, we need to develop some physical characteristics such as mobility and stability. So that's the starting point. Now, give you an idea of distance per stroke. If you click on now, Marcus, this is what we use when we do biomech in rowing. And what we've got along the x-axis here is the length of the stroke, and on the y-axis is force. So we can see that even though, and we'll pretend, I'm not actually sure what this is, whether it's a sculler or two sweep rowers, but if we pretend there's two rowers, we can see the person with the red line actually produces more force. But the thing we're really looking for on one of these things is the overall amount of area under the curve. And we can see that the green line, even though it doesn't produce as much force and doesn't get it on quite as quick, because they have more length at the back, it comes further down here. I'll just show it to you guys. Because it comes further here, we actually have more area under the curve with this area here. So you can also see this red line actually almost get in the water at the same time, come out of the water at the same time. But they just have really a period there with the blades in the water, but they're not actually applying any force. They're not giving any more to the boat. So that's one thing we can look at to improve distance stroke length. Next thing is boat run. So I guess if there's any S&C coaches in the room, we can understand the application of power, how it might move the boat when the blade's in the water. But when the athlete's moving back down the slide in recovery, this can also have a really significant impact on boat speed. In fact, boat speed is fastest just after the blade comes out. So making sure we let the boat run effectively is really important. And to do that really effectively, we need to get into a good position again. We need to rock over at the hips, let the boat slide under the body. So to be able to rock over effectively, again, we need hip mobility, and we need a lot of stability and control to allow smooth controlled movements. And then I guess the final factor there that coaches always talk about is boat feel. And I guess that's something I can't talk to too much because I'm not a rower. Then the third factor there, we've got skill. Some things about S&C, we probably maybe not be able to impact that. So maybe it's just the way someone puts a blade in the water, or their timing, or their fine motor skills around the handle. But there's often there's things that people are trying to fix, or coaches are trying to fix, that maybe have a physical component. So that's when we can. If we look at this in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got another. Can't see it very well because the Zoom thing's in the corner, but we just move that for the people in the room. Yeah, thank you. So again, we can see here where I was talking about the last row when we used, they had a bit of a lost position at the ends. And in fact, if we can see here, the blades in the water all this time, they're there and there, but they're actually not really applying any force. They're not, they should be up here. We have to get the blade in the water and start applying force. And this is all just kept on. So what we call that is ineffective length. It's the blades in the water, but we're actually not really helping the boat move forward. And that would be one thing that in a less skilled person we would see more often. Okay, next slide. So now we move on to power, which obviously what I find interesting, or most interesting, and probably the thing that probably makes a lot more sense to people where we, as a strength and conditioning coach, we can make an impact. But it's not just the ability to employ force and power, it's also the ability to do it without losing that energy. And I call that sort of energy leak. So maybe driving off the front, but letting the seat slide, or losing position through the shoulders, or rounding the back would be elements of energy being lost during the rowing stroke and not transferring from the foot plate to the hands to the blade. So we need to try and minimize that, which we can do by sort of making it stronger through the core and the hips. So that's what I'm talking about here, strong position to catch. So we need the glutes to really, and the hamstrings to really anchor the hips. So when the legs drive, the seat moves, but everything's connected. And then the power application throughout the stroke of an explosive and connected leg drive, and then an explosive hip extension, which really quite requires a good position right from the start. And coming back to our biomechanical graph, you can see here a very clear example of someone who's producing a lot more force than someone else. And then you can see that like the area under the curve is a lot superior with the black or grey line, whatever that is. Okay, so what we really want is this green line here. I believe this is the Rio men's quad won silver. I mean, it's pretty amazing that even with a elite crew like that, you can have one person stand out as much as that. But what we really want is, I just come for the people in the room. This green line, instead of getting into the front, they hold probably the longest stroke length. Well, they definitely hold the longest stroke length, but they also get the biggest power as well. So they would definitely be the ones propelling the boat the furthest. So that's probably the aim if we can address all those factors. So just for the first bit of this presentation, I just want to go over that from an S&C coach's perspective and how we can help impact our rowing crews. If we can improve distance per stroke, or give our athletes the tools to improve distance per stroke, and that's a key thing. And this requires power. So that's obviously a force and velocity component, mobility, stability, and coordination. And on top of that, we need to be able to do it for over 240 strokes, up to 10 minutes. And that requires aerobic capacity, strength, endurance. I wanted to share this little bit of information, but I wasn't really sure where to put it in the presentation. So I decided to plonk it in here because it's not really completely related, but I'm not from a rowing background at all. I played team sports. But when I started with rowing, there was one thing I really could not understand, that it's everyone races 2 kilometers. Yeah, you can tap on actually. Everyone races 2 kilometers. Yeah, coaches have completely different ways of training athletes to get to that. So for instance, the person on the left here is John Keogh's the coach I work with, and he puts a huge amount of emphasis into strength training in our programs. It's a big thing in our program. But the person on the right is Ian Wright, and he was the men's head coach in the last cycle. And I would say that was a relatively low priority in their program. They definitely did weights, but I don't think it was the biggest priority. And I've seen that all my career. Like some people really value it, and some, we do it, but it's not that important. So right, how can this be? Everyone races the same distance. And then I work with athletes like these two ladies. So the girl and these both, they were our strongest pair in their last cycle, and they were in the 4 that won gold. And they also tried to win a medal in the pair. They doubled up, and it didn't go so well. But I'm confident if it would have worked another way, they would probably won silver in that event. Not sure they'd have managed to beat the Kiwis. But the girl on the left is Jess Morrison, and in the gym, she's an absolute weapon. She hits all our benchmarks. She's strong, powerful, completely athletic. And then the girl on the right, Annabelle McIntyre, she's a great technician on the water, but in the gym, not particularly impressive at all. Actually, you probably could argue that we've got the top of the squad and the worst of the squad in the gym. So I think I've always found that really how can that happen and then both be elite rowers? Now Annabelle's got really long leverages, which are really good for rowing, probably not particularly good for some strength training exercises, but I never really completely, I always questioned why this was. The range of philosophies and the range of athletes we see for people who do exactly the same distance. Because if we click on to the next one, like I'd probably like to relate a lot of things in rowing to athletics, because running I can sort of relate to a little bit more. This is the athletes in the final of the 1500 meters in Tokyo last year. And I think rowing probably equates to 3,000 meters in running. But in these guys, I'm pretty certain if we had looked at these guys physically, I'm sure they'd all have high aerobic capacity. I'm sure they'd all have pretty high aerobic thresholds. They'd probably have reasonably decent and similar top speeds, like if they were running 100 meters. They'd be pretty reactive on the ground. They'd probably be able to sort of propel themselves with really low, slow foot contacts. So why in another endurance event would you have such a similar group of individuals, and in rowing you just be this like complete mix, and they're all world class. And I was in Italy with the team a few years ago, and I was the sprint cycling team were there, and I was chatting to the sprint cycling S&C coach. He just made a comment to me, and I was like, oh, I can't believe I've never looked at it that way before, and trying to slip on. And I think the thing in rowing is we have a long time to apply force. The blade's in the water for a long time. Just click on to the next one. Yeah. So if we think about that, at rate 30, oh, sorry. So I don't. At rate 30, it's at 2 seconds between when the blade goes in the water. Pretty basic maths. And what we also know is as the rate goes up, as the rate would go up from say 30 to 40, the actual time the blade's in the water doesn't actually change much. What changes is the speed of the recovery. So I got some data from a biomechanist at NSWIS from the Interstate Regatta in 2019, and a men's A blade was in the water for 0.66 of a second. And I think Jen Horton was in the single, and her blade's in the water for 0.9. So I normally use a reference of 0.7 of a second in the water, which in sport is a huge amount of time, like absolutely huge. If you look at like 1,500 meter runners, they're probably on the floor, their foot's on the floor for maybe 0.15, 0.2 meters per second. A sprinter will be on 0.1. Even a sort of track endurance cyclist, they'd be probably 120 RPM. Sprint canoe about 120 RPM. So then that started to sort of really make a lot of sense to me that, oh, we can have people, like we've got a sport where you get so much time to apply force and apply power. You can have people coming from the strength end of the spectrum, and you can have people from the aerobic end of the spectrum. You can have technicians too, and then you can coach it along those lines as well. So for me, that was a really interesting thing. I just wanted to share it. Okay, so if we talk about, I thought we'd just talk about injuries now, because I know that's quite prevalent in school age rowers, and actually at the elite level we tend to have ribs quite a lot, but I know in school age it's more to do with lower back. So I've got these two videos. I apologize, the video quality is not great, but I think they'll be good enough if they work. Let's go. Maybe I just think we worth saving it to the actual computer. It's on the, no, it's not on the memory stick. It's really okay. We'll have to go without it. Hopefully the other videos work, but maybe they won't. So we'll have to go without the videos. So basically this guy on the left, I've got no idea who he was. I found it on YouTube, but it's possibly the worst deadlift you're going to ever see. He's rounding his back horribly. And normally when I show it in a presentation, everyone in the room goes, oh, ooh, hear the noises. And then the video on the right is some of our high performance rowers from NSWIS in the past. And in my eyes, they do exactly the same thing, but no one sits there and goes, oh, that was painful. If you go on to the next slide. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is show if it's okay for someone to, it's not okay for someone to deadlift in such a horrible position, but it is okay to row. And I would question whether that's right, although obviously the real problem with the heavy deadlift is the quantity of the load, which is what we see as being more dangerous. Okay, so this is just a slide and some diagrams from a Canadian biomechanist, Stuart McGill, whose wife, I believe, was a rower, and he's quite interested in rowing, so it's quite good for us. And when we look at back injuries, I guess we've probably got three main mechanisms. One is just like the deadlifter, one acute incidents of someone hurting themselves. And then we have other things that can sort of create it. Like, so the example of the cyclist is just holding a bad position for long periods of times, maybe a 5-hour ride, doing that day in, day out. And in time that can sort of become a problem. And then I guess in rowing, what we have is the repeated loading. And one of the things we think is probably the biggest issue is the level of flexion through the lower back. Although that's been challenged a little bit at the moment, which is quite interesting. And people are arguing it's not actually the amount of flexion through the lower back, it's the movement into flexion under load. So if you get into position to catch and you're flexed, but you hold that exact same position the whole time, maybe that's not so bad. But if you go into a position and as you pull the load, you go into more lumbar flexion, well, that's particularly dangerous. So that might explain a little bit why some people can row their whole careers in what I would perceive to be a bad position, but not get injured, and others get injured. Now, what we've got here is the jagged line is the applied load. So you can imagine if someone is rowing with what I perceive poor technique or getting into bad positions, that applied load will be bigger. And if someone is moving quite efficiently in position, that applied load is lower. And then you've got your tolerance. So tolerance is like your ability to withstand your training. And what we want to do is keep a big, you can see the margin of safety there. We want to keep a big margin of safety. And then obviously the point where the tolerance meets the applied load is the point where we tend to have an injury. So I guess the one way I look at trying to train my athletes is I want to increase that gap. So I've talked a bit about the flexion there. This is really old. This is probably over 10 years old from rowing Australia. No one's ever going to get into that position in position one. And maybe I'd argue maybe they should never either. But position two is probably what we should be asking for. If in the rowing stroke, if people can get their pelvis beyond vertical or at vertical, then we're going pretty well. Okay, so as I was talking before, I see our aim is to reduce the applied load by getting people moving more efficiently, so there's less load being applied each stroke. And then if we can make people stronger, we can increase that tolerance. And then hopefully we never get to a point where the two sort of cross over. Okay, so I guess some of the points I've been trying to get across here is that the development of movement quality in young athletes will help them row better and make the boat go faster, because they can row through greater length, they can be more connected. Reduce the risk of low back injuries because they're in better positions and there's less load on their back, and also better prepare them for sort of heavier strength training methods in the future. So if they're moving well, they've got good, what we call movement competence, then that's a better position for them to be in when we start really loading them a little bit more. Go back. So the key things we're looking at is strength, flexibility, mobility, stability, and balance, what I call function, competence. And then I like this picture of this weightlifter, because he's looks absolutely rock solid with, I don't know, probably 160, 170 kilos over his head after doing a snatch. But also we see a lot of athletes now that can't get into these positions. But this is my daughter when she was not even one. I don't even know if she could walk at this point, but she can sit in that squat position for like ages. So we have this movement capability when we're young, and we gradually lose that as we grow at different rates or we live a sedentary lifestyle. So I think that's a good example. Okay, make things harder. I apologise if I offend any young people in the room, but we see worse, definitely in my sort of, if I go back to sort of 20 years when I first started doing this, young athletes today don't move as well, they're not as mobile, they're not as athletic, and it makes it more challenging. So it's almost like we need to do more work in this space, which I guess is one reason why there's such a push on strength training now, or resistance training in young athletes compared to maybe what they would have been 20 years ago. And that's a product of lifestyle changes. And I think that's likely to contribute to higher rates of injury in children. I don't know whether that's something that's seen in school coaches who've worked with school athletes for a long time, but my perception is that we see more injuries. And the key issues we have are poor hip mobility, hip flexors and hamstrings in particular, and poor glute control and core strength. Yeah. So I don't know if this video works. It's good. I don't know why this one's working, the other's not. But these aren't rowers. These are track and field athletes. And I just wanted to show some examples of, this is about 10 years ago, of just not good movement and what we see a lot of the time. So really, you should be able to get as low as the guy on the left, the Olympic weightlifter. But you can see he struggles for range. He can't keep his arms back. You get a massive arch in his lower back as he does this, which is his way of trying to get as low as he can. Another example, he can get a little bit deeper, but I think when we look from the side, we'll find his arms come a long way forward because he can't keep his the bar above his head or keep the bar back. And you see his heels are also coming up off the floor because he hasn't got a range. And I'm sure most school programs will probably see some similar things across a group of individuals. So their tolerance is going to be quite low. And I would imagine if they were rowing, would also have a poor range margin. So single leg squat, this is another good exercise we can use to give us an idea of someone's relative strength. Unloaded, good for young people. Again, the track and field guys, you can see how hard he finds this to go through any range and also control his hip and knee position. It looks like he could do a ACL here, which is pretty unusual for someone just doing squats. And side on, some of the things you can see here is that he just pushes his knee forward. That's the way his mechanism getting down. So he's completely loading his quad and his knee joint, and he's not really taking any load through his heel at all. And again, I don't know if you noticed, but his heel was coming off the floor. Same thing, pretty limited range. Bit better, a bit more in alignment, but his range is still really poor. And I suspect if we look from the side, this is just going to be his knee pushing forward again. So I know I've got another video which I couldn't get to work. It's quite old, where I had a whole load of rowers and like Olympic medalists and quite high level rowers, and we saw similar things with them as well. So okay, so this is Georgie Gotch, who I guess one of the things I've worked at NSWIS for 13 years. And one of the good things about doing that is you can work with an athlete from juniors all the way through to World Championship representation. So Georgie, I think, would have been on that was the first video, wasn't it? The first video. So she would have been about a junior here. So I think she went to 2 World Juniors, a few under 23s. I think she won a silver medal in 2015 in a quad, and then came into the national program. And I think she won a bronze medal in 2018 women's 8. Which was probably the pinnacle of her career. She was a reserve for the Rio Olympics. So what we can see with Georgie here is just run it again, if we can. Oh, yeah. So we can see actually not bad movement at the hip, but inability to sort of be able to keep those arms back and hold the bar overhead. She's also got sort of a pattern where her knees go a long way forward. So that's I reckon this is a 17, 18-year-old. 2011 it was, so you can work it out if you want. The next one is 2 years later. 2 years later, as a we presume a 20, maybe a 20-year-old. Might just actually have to tap it. Weird, isn't it? Oh, sorry about this. It looks like it's not going to work. So what I was trying to do here is show someone over a series of years and how you can improve this, and how by training they can go from quite a, yeah, this is a single leg squat. So the same thing, hopefully that, again, as you can see here, she just loses the hip position slightly. It's not terrible. I don't think this one's going to work either, is it? Why don't you just add a little video? Yeah, so the aim was to show that over a course of 10 or even 2 years, you can get significant changes if you practice it. And you can do there's simple things like in the single leg squat, simple things like just sit into a box with one leg, or even using a weight as a counterbalance can help it. And we can talk a bit more about that later.
Do you actually measure it as well? Do you measure something specifically and then each time they do it?
Oh, I normally just use a video and just, yeah, people like to, there is some systems around scoring if you wanted to, but I use a bit more subjective rather than sort of quantitative approach to that. And because we video it all, we just can, every year we can say, okay, there's some progress there and not other times. Yeah. Okay, so this is what I think the school age program and the progression should look like. Although I'm also someone who doesn't have a job reliant on a performance on any given weekend, but this would be the way I think it should look like over a sort of a course of a school aged athlete's career. So just flick that on, Marcus, thanks. So the first things we should be working on are our sort of functional movement, competence, mobility, hip, thoracic and ankle. We should be able to do an overhead squat. We should, I think, even if it was a broom handle, it should be a lot better than those track and field athletes I shared there. It should have stability around the hip, lumbar spine and scapula. And then competence in body weight movements, things like the overhead squat, single leg squat, push up, supine pull up, even maybe a pull up. I guess one of the advantages of using body weight movements, especially if you can incorporate them early in programs, like we're incorporating them when they're actually lighter. So like if they can master it as a 11, 12-year-old, as they get bigger, hopefully their strength progresses with it. And then we can have them in a good place by the time they're 14, 15. We should be looking for really good symmetry. So that's left leg, right leg should be pretty even, and like muscle balance anterior and posteriorly. Now we know in rollers, because it's a kind of a leg-driven sport and quad-driven, tend to have more dominant sort of anterior than posterior, but I think that's something that can be worked on early. Like with these year 8 or 9 kind of age athletes, use of body weight and med balls is perfect. Light weights, multi-planar, so like rowing is obviously very sagittal plane, straight up and down. But I think getting them out of just going straight up and down is really beneficial. And if need be, like I can understand logistics around running sessions, get them in a circuit, that's perfectly fine. And I think the key thing about this is we're not only going to help them be more connected, row longer, and it's probably still going to have some beneficial impact with regards to force production and power, but it's also going to be a great way to set someone up for the next phase of their strength training as well. So we just tap that on. Yeah. So the next stage then from there for me will be, this is when we start, we've got them in good position, they've got good movement competence, their mobility is good, their function is good. We can start adding some loading. And yeah, so same kind of movements, we're going to sort of start bringing in squat variations, deadlift variations. If able to coach Olympic lift variations, I think if you can't coach it well, I think like jumping movements and med ball tosses are just as good and usable. Upper body pull, upper body pushing movements, so you can just carry on with your pull-ups or supine pull-ups, push-ups and supine pull-ups, or we can start doing some dumbbell rowing or seated rowing, some dumbbell pushing, pressing. Single leg exercise I think is important, and what I call posterior chain, hamstrings, glutes, calf work. It's really useful. So what was that last bit there? Mobility around the hip, thoracic ankle is still really important. It's not as if we go away from that once it's been established. That's something that we need to keep working on. Keep that stability around the hip, and symmetry is still really important. So that was the main thing I wanted to talk about with regards to how I think a school program should look. I did want to talk a little bit more about some of the mobility issues and flexibility issues where I think AB wanted me to focus on, and it's probably really relevant in the school age group, and maybe just some strategies beyond just stretching that can help us get there, although stretching will be what I talk about. So probably the main area that stops us getting into a good position of the couch, getting our hips over, getting that rock over and then coming down the slide, are hamstring flexibility, deep hip external rotators. So they're the muscles sort of deep in the hip that sort of control our underneath the glute and our hip flexors. And then from a strength perspective, weakness in the trunk and the glutes. And I'll try and put that all together for you now. Okay, so just tap on one more. Yeah, that's perfect. So why do muscles become tight? I guess one way they become tight is that they spend a lot of time in shortened positions, and that's what we see with the muscles at the front of their hips, because people spend so much time seated these days, so they become tight. The other reason is because they can become overworked, and that can be because other muscles aren't working effectively. Then say I'll talk about hamstrings. If the glutes don't work, glutes and hamstrings are both hip extensors. If the glutes don't work effectively, then the hamstring is going to create that hip extension. It's going to get overworked, potentially get tight. But working with the current physio I work with, he often thinks muscles become overworked because they're weak. So their tolerance for work is quite low, and then they get overworked because they can't handle the work that's been doing. So a lot of the time when we have people who are quite tight, one of our strategies might be, depending on the situation, might be to actually strengthen that muscle, which probably something I wouldn't have done 5 years ago. Okay, so if we think about hip extension, the gluteals are the prime mover for extending the hip, but lots of the time we find that people's glutes don't work that well. So if they're not working effectively, what will happen is the hamstrings will do the work, because that's also a hip extensor. Hamstrings don't get overworked, start getting tight, and then we have less room for pelvic rock. So one way to sort of address hamstring tightness is to try and make sure people are using their gluteal muscles more effectively. Next. And what we also find is people's hip flexors get really tight, which is kind of seems to be quite a constant in the world at the moment. Their glutes get inhibited because the balance of where your hip is compared to, or where your position for your glute. If your hips, sorry, I'll start that again. If your hip flexors are tight, you probably sit in a sort of anterior tilted pelvic position, and that puts then the glutes at greater length, and then that's not a great position for them to work. So the kind of two have a relationship. So if you lengthen your hip flexors, you'll be able to use your glutes more. If you use your glutes more, your hamstrings won't get overworked. And then if hamstrings are not overworked, then they won't be getting tight. But unfortunately, the opposite is happening at the moment. Okay. So this, yeah, I'll say that's just an example of stretch, and that's a change on Kieran. You can see in one time we tested. So this test, the 90-90 test, you keep your knee vertical, and then you straighten your leg as much as you can. You can see his knee's still quite bent on the left-hand picture, and then maybe 6 months later, he's made quite a nice improvement. Okay. So improving, what we're trying to get across is improving glute function, can improve hamstring range because your hamstrings aren't getting overworked, can lead to better rock over position, which creates less, if you're getting your hips over further, you don't have to bend around your back as much to get in position. So then you're sort of less lumbar flexion, and then hopefully a decreased chance of injury. Also, the glutes are the biggest, actually just tap back, yeah, the glutes are your biggest muscle in the body. So you want a pretty ineffective strategy if you're not going to use your biggest muscle in the body when you're doing sport. So if you can use them, you get improved performance and less requirement on your lumbar extensors in the second half of the rowing stroke. Okay, your deep external rotator is just the same sort of thing going on here. What happens is the glutes are also an external rotator of the hip. So external rotation would be just opening up your hip. So if your glutes aren't performing that function, same thing happens. The deeper muscles under in the hip, which aren't really designed to produce force, they're just designed to keep the head of your femur in the socket. It's like your rotator cuff of your hip. Then starting doing work to create external rotation. So they either become overworked, they become tight. We need we need those muscles to be free because they restrict hip internal rotation. Internal rotation, again, is important for a rockover. So again, we have a deep situation where we have deep glute, decreased glute activation, increased external hip rotation activation. They become overworked, they become tight, and then we reduce the rockover. So probably two sort of real areas to think about: the hamstrings and your deep external hip rotators. And if we can get our glutes working better, even without stretching, we probably could have an impact there. So, but not to say we shouldn't stretch, and we should stretch. So these are just a couple of slides. The ellipsoas is a hip flexor, which just crosses the hip. And we can stretch that by putting yourself into extension, really. Raising the arms is a good way of doing it. Always instruct your athletes or your students to sort of engage the core and squeeze the glute, and that will help bring on the stretch a little bit better. Next slide, we'll talk about the rec fem. So rec fem is one of your quads, but it does also cross the hip as well. So it crosses your hip and your knee. So to stretch that effectively, you need to not only come into hip extension, so much the same way, but you also need to bring your knee into flexion as well. So you can do that by the one of me in the top right there, just raising the foot or putting your foot on a bench. It's a good way of doing that, but you still need to core on, squeeze glutes, and push the hip forward. So two different kind of stretches for two different hip flexors. Your tensor fasciae latae, which is, or TFL as we normally call it, is a muscle that's just in the front of the hip here. It attaches to your iliotibial band, which runs all the way down the outside of your thigh. And this can create hip flexion, hip abduction as well. So it's a hard thing to stretch. Triggering is probably often better. You can trigger straight on the muscle. And you can use foam roller for the IT band, and that often has a effective impact. And in hamstring stretches, I think we know a few hamstring stretches. I don't have many preferences, but we can definitely use proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation for that if you want. It's often been effective. We use downward dogs, the one in the top left-hand corner, all the time. It's a regular in our program because it kind of stretches the whole posterior chain, calf, hamstring, glute, lower back. But I don't really have much of a preference there, just it needs to be stretched. And then I think we might talk about glutes now. Is it? Yeah, gluteals. So as mentioned, it tends to be weak in a lot of populations at the moment, and I don't think rowers is any different. We can address it in lots of different ways, but one of the ways we see at the moment is, I was talking about knee dominant patterns and some of those videos of the guys where they're just pushing their knee forward rather than sinking back into their hips. And I think generally in rowing, especially what I've seen maybe in school age rowers, where I understand why, but it might be an easy way to just put someone on a leg press because it's technically less demanding. We can get a good stimulus. I definitely don't want to say don't use the leg press, but it's pretty much an anterior chain. So you're almost going to sort of push. Yeah, you're kind of pushing the same problem. So don't get me wrong, still leg press, but maybe do something else to balance that out. So ways to do that, you can alter your movement patterns. So focus on more hip dominant patterns. Drive through the heels rather than the toes, or at least through a flat foot anyway. Move hips back rather than knees forward. So you can, I don't know, you could use a chair or a box to encourage people to sit back towards that rather than maybe the natural pattern, like the picture on the left there where the knees are just moving forwards. And I think using single leg exercise is a good way of recruiting the glutes as well. So increase the amount of that in your program. So as mentioned earlier, I would often use the single leg squat like we had with Georgie there. It's a good test. Oh, let's go back. It's a good test. And what we can see often is knees rolling in and the knees going forward as issues. When you probably indications of people who are not using their glutes as much as they should. Next. So the way we can train the glutes, there's lots of different ways. We can use what we call isolation exercises. So they're the pictures across the top, like your clams or oysters, bridging kind of movements. We use bands a lot at the moment. I'm sure probably do that at schools. Hip thrusts, They're all kind of isolated, just single joint movements, a way to target it directly, and you should do that. But then you can also do something a little bit more complex involving more joints. So we can use single leg exercises. There's a Bulgarian squat there, a lunge there, and a step up. They're all good options. And when we're doing these, we want to try and keep the shin fairly vertical. Keep good alignment, so we're not letting that knee roll in and the hip roll out. Drive through the heels, and then keeping the hips level. And just sometimes it's just a cue about, think about activating your glutes, think about loading your glutes as you do it. It's good. Other ways we can do it, still double leg movements, things like your squats. Probably need to go into deep positions if we're going to load the glutes through your squats. Deadlifts and Romanian deadlifts, which are pretty much staples of my program as well. Load that area as well. Again, key cueing, the hips back. Don't let the knees travel excessively forward. Drive through the heels. And again, just a cue around glute activation. Okay, so the last little bit, there we go. I just want to talk about core training because I think it's really important. I think it's way we can maybe reduce low back injuries in rowers, but also I think it's just a massive thing for transferring force from the leg drive on the foot plate through to the hips, through to the handle, and the core plays a really important role. So we're trying to minimize energy leaks, use the core as a stable lever. Like I always talk about, just using it as a rod. You just don't want to lose anything there. You just want to transfer everything across. And in my eyes, it requires isometric strength under challenges of instability that's provided by the bow, the blade, the forces you're applying from the legs as we go. So I just share it now. Well, this will come up. So if we go one at a time, so just tap that one. So there's a few things. The one, probably the most important one for rowing, is the anti-flexion. So that's probably the thing as we're driving the legs, trying to engage the blade in the water. What happens more often is just we have a rounding of positions. One is because we can't get into a good position, but often happens because once we get in a good position, then we haven't got enough strength there to transfer it. Just have a collapse in there. Now, I think I've got some slides on that one. The next one, any extension. This doesn't happen so much. This is like an arching of the back. Well, we do see it sometimes with really mobile rowers that can get into good positions really easily. They might even overextend at the catch, or they might overextend at the back. So that's something we probably still need to work on. We've got anti-lateral flexion. So this is moving, not being able to hold position laterally. So the video at top's a runner I work with, and she's always like this. And we can train that by holding better positions, and we'll go through it in a minute. Anti-rotation. So obviously when sweeping, we do want to rotate, and we want to be able to rotate under control and smoothly, but in sculling, we don't want to rotate. And the same girl there, she's always kind of one hand's in front of the other or is off. So we want to be able to control our rotation, certainly in sculling, to be able to place the blades evenly. And the last one, obviously for our sweep rowers, we need to be able to get a level of rotation to get in good position. So again, that works with the making sure we get good stroke length, as we spoke about right at the very start. So just ways to train it. So the anti-flexion one, whilst it's probably the most important, it's also probably the most ticked off in a traditional strength training program. So when you're doing a squat or a deadlift, you actually have to manage to stop yourself just collapsing. You have to manage the flexion. So like any of those exercises, we use a few exercises. The glute ham raise at the top on the right, we use that quite a lot as an exercise just to load the lower back. It's a way to test as well. We test our athletes using that position, and they have to hold it as long as they can. And we stop them at a certain time if we think they've reached a good time. We use the exercise in the bottom left as well, where we just tie off an ergo. And the aim there is that they just raise their bum off the seat a very small amount, like a centimetre, and they have to hold that position by pushing their feet through the foot plate and taking the load through the core. And then, like I said before, we've got things like back squats, good mornings, Romanian deadlifts are loading that pattern as well. Any extensions, so these are exercises we can use for that. So any kind of leg lowering movement where we're trying not to arch the lower back, we're trying to hold connected position, lower the legs whilst holding a the same sort of neutral position in the lower back. I normally just ask the athletes to keep their back flat on the floor. Things like rollouts, whether it be a Swiss ball or a bar or a wheel, walkouts, dead bugs, bird dogs, even planks, are all relevant there. Anti-lateral flexion, that would be where we use things like side planks, just getting people in a position and holding that position still. We use things like suitcase deadlifts. The little picture I've got on the left, the oblique hold, we use that quite a lot at the moment. We think that's a pretty good way of challenge that lateral strength in our athletes. We sometimes do squats with a different weight on each side of the bar, not very much, but might have 10 on one side, nothing on the other, and then just they've got to be really symmetrical and keep the bar flat and use their core to sort of manage that offset weight. Next one will be anti-rotation. So quite a few exercises you can do there. We use a paddle press, which is the one at the top, where we just hold a cable to your side or a band. You're going to stand here and you just push out in front of you. And basically, you've got a long lever, short lever. So when the lever's long, it's going to pull you around more, and you've got to control that rotation. Exercises like the bottom left, where they're raising one arm, got to try and keep even pressure under their knees. And the hips nice and stable when they do that. And chop movements like the bottom right. There's lots and lots of exercises you can do in that space. And the final one will be rotation. So we use Swiss ball hug rotations at top right. Lots of med ball work. We do lots of med ball throwing. Cable chops, standing cable lifts. Lots of different options there. Russian twists. There, so I think that might be it. There we go. Happy to take any questions and hang around to go through any exercises or anything like that if we want. Yeah.
When you see someone pushing down to the drive and you see the knees either come together, or the other way with some people, as you said, you go that way, is that glutes or hip flexors or not?
Just repeat that question for people online if they didn't hear that. I've got a question around a rower whose knees come to each other as they come down the slide, and when they push off, what's that due to? Is that hip flexors? Is that glutes? Or I would say that would be a gluteal function. Yeah, like anytime we kind of see the knees coming in, they're probably not engaging through the glutes, because yeah.
One of the other coaches,
they go out. Yeah. So the next question was why do people's knees go out? I'm not so sure about that one, but I think that's probably just the way they can get in position. So I'd look at that. I'd take that back and do a bit of an assessment on land, because I think sometimes that might be something as simple as their ankle range, and you might be able to fix that by just playing around with their foot position or something like that. So yeah, I think we've got a few girls at the centre who do that, and I think it's their inability to get their hips into position with the knees straight, so they'll find a way. It might be ankle, it could be the hip range of motion thing, but less obvious. Yeah.
What are some good exercises to increase that ankle range? So if you're a little bit limited there.
Yeah. Well, I think calf stretching would be a starting point. You can do some stuff with a band. I didn't bring any stuff with me, but you can almost like hook a band around a machine or whatever, and then pull it around, and then just work into keeping your heel on the floor, push in, and then just get the bands, provide some extra tension as you do that. And you can do that both ways, with the band pulling you forward and going away. That's the sort of exercise I use with my athletes a week in that area. They're probably the main ones. Yeah, normally just sort of some mobility, and sometimes it can be linked to hamstrings as well, because they've got like a fascial connection flying side. Yeah.
Going back to your coaching philosophies, and obviously John, as you said, puts a lot of emphasis on strength and Ian did. Was that because he's dealing with women and Ian was dealing with men, and just had to deal with different strength anyway?
Yeah. So the questions around the philosophies of the two coaches I referred to earlier, John and Ian, and whether the reason for the different philosophies is male versus female. I think, well, I'm obviously a strength and conditioning coach, so I've got my biases. But I think males can probably get away with it a little bit more because of just more natural strength levels. I think it probably does play an more important part for females. But I mean, since I've worked with Jürgen Grobler, for instance, and he would have 4 strength sessions a week throughout the year. Like, he was a massive component of his program. So I think it's probably more important for females than males. I don't think you'd have an effective female program with Ian's approach. I struggle to believe you would. I don't want to believe you would. But you probably can get away with it more with the men. Yeah, I think it's a fair question. Yeah.
So you could get away with just mobility and core strength training, and then cardio-based training, and that's all you could do as a male athlete?
Oh, I don't think there'd be too many people that do that. Like, so Ian's group would still do 3 sessions a week. The problem is they had such an emphasis on their aerobic work, and they did such high volumes. The strength sessions became like the way the guys applied themselves in the strength session. It was really about getting through to the next session. So it was not done with what I would see as the intent and purpose you would need to do to get some adaptations. But I still did strength training.
Did it do anything though? That's the question.
Sorry?
Did that strength training do anything?
Well, it probably helped them not lose mass. And it probably helped them maintain what they had. So I think it would have done something, but I don't think it wasn't a priority. I guess that's what I'm saying. I mean, I think that I've heard stories about the Kiwi men's pair through the London and Rio cycles, or obviously gun pair, didn't do much weight training, but I'm pretty certain they did quite a lot of weight training early in their career. It was only as they got older and they had established some physical characteristics that were pretty strong, they were able to sort of back off of that. So, yeah.
Dave,
Yeah.
Well, sort of carrying on from that same point, you can obviously do a fair amount of resistance training in the boat by, for example,
Banded, power strokes. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you are coaching and you're making sure posture is right, and you basically have your focus as a coach and as an athlete is on executing the most perfect movement you can with that added resistance, is that I wouldn't say a replacement for doing main training, it's so different, but it's still dynamic, isn't it? But is it I'm just thinking, to Marcus's question, that
Yeah.
I'm sure that's what the men at the entrance did.
They would have done a fair amount of banded work, resisted work. I wouldn't say it's a replacement, but it might maintain it better than other training modalities. Yeah. They still did 3 weight sessions a week. I just think it could have been more effective for the way they did it. Yeah. So
It's just the amount of hours they spent weight training compared to cardio is skewed.
Yeah. And the guys weren't engaged. They still got good results, gold and bronze, same results as us. So yeah. So yeah, just different philosophies, different approaches. Not necessarily one's right and the other one's wrong. I think we see that all the time. Yeah.
And I think your reference to the fact that if you do a good weights program early in your rowing career, how that stands you in very good stead. And to be really honest, a lot of our good rowers come from school programs in boys' schools, which definitely pay attention to that. Whereas I wouldn't say that the emphasis in the past in girls' schools has been on that. It's been more about just getting where a lot of women come to rowing later.
Yeah.
As well.
I think one of the other things is that actually in a lot of injuries, well, virtually all injuries, the biggest risk of an injury is the previous injury, the same previous injury. And certainly in backs, there's plenty of evidence to say the biggest risk of a low back injury in an elite rower is previous low back injury, or even in the school agers. So if you can get onto it and stop those things happening early, then it may not be a problem in the future. Yeah.
I guess more just on the coaching side of it, if you was talking about engagement.
Yeah.
When you have an athlete, when you have an athlete that's tired, overworked, can't be bothered dealing with you saying that you go 3 centimeters lower or whatever.
Yeah.
How do you keep them engaged? What's your kind of attitude around the gym?
Well, I think I'm fortunate because a lot of our sort of training philosophy is driven by the head coach and our other coaches as well. So there's a lot of emphasis, and we managed to get quite a good. I think we've managed to get quite a good culture in place around the way we do strength training now. Well, the message I try and get across to the girls is, like, they're rowers, they're often going to be tired, they're often not going to be at their best. We understand that, but and I'm not expecting you to go and do a PB every day because it's just not the way it works. But if you're not so good one day, well, the main aim is that we're going to come in and do a solid session. Now, that will not probably mean you're doing what you lift the week before or what we hope you lift next week, but we can still give you a reasonable stimulus that is going to, in the whole picture of our year and our whole training, be a appropriate sort of load and be a positive thing. But we're just not going to do anything crazy, but we're just going to come in and do a sort of thing. So I that's something I try and get in quite early with the girls, and I think they understand that, and that's my approach now. I don't know whether that would work as well for a 15-year-old schoolgirl who might be rolling because she's got to do a sport through summer. I don't know. Yeah. So, but they're all obviously there because they want to go to the Olympics and win a medal and stuff. So it's probably an easier conversation to have. But that's my approach. I've kind of gone away in the past. I would have gone, if they're cooked, so I'll just back right off. But then you end up backing off quite a lot. And then I don't know whether in the long run you get the stimulus you need to get the adaptation. So yeah, that's the way I kind of work it. It's like, okay, well, you're tired, you're not feeling great. Let's just try and get a solid session in.
Yeah, there's always that probably concurrent training, isn't it? But, you know, you can have aerobic training in the morning, long session, or relatively you're doing a weight session 2 hours afterwards, which in theory shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And then you can have a session after that as well. So, yeah, obviously the people will be very robust to manage that. So, yeah, as you say, there's time when you take that into consideration, like you've done 2 hours of water, and you then try to heavy session with them afterwards. So,
Yeah.
Got to balance it out. Do you back off or do you just keep?
Yeah, well, I think, so I don't know whether people can hear the questions. No, I know I'm repeating some and not others, but the question is, one of our challenges with concurrent training is that athletes are often fatigued and they're not getting the recovery between their row and their weight session that academic papers would suggest they have, which would be like 4 hours. So that might be okay if they're training twice a day, but when we train 3 times a day, that can become challenging. So how do we manage that is the question. And I think obviously I work with a really good head coach who I think puts together a good program. So I think a lot of the time we won't be doing hugely fatiguing stuff before, like, so Monday, for instance, first session of the week, they just basically go out and have a row. Obviously still intent and purpose in what they do, but it's not like not pieces or a real key session. So we lift after that. I don't think it's the worst situation. Thursday becomes a bit more challenging because they're often doing 2 times 5K, but it's still an aerobic session. It's not as neurally demanding. And then on Saturday, we actually lift. So we'll do, in a heavy week with the girls, we'll do 16 sessions a week, or actually even a pretty standard week will be 16 sessions. And we do weights 16th session. And coach goes to me a few years ago, oh yeah, I just don't think we get much out of that second row on a Saturday, so we'll do weights. But it surprised me, actually. It's really surprised me. I think we do get something out of it. And like, I think they actually, yeah, I think it's been an effective thing. So they are obviously more fatigued on Saturday than they are on the Monday, but I think there's a psychological component to a lot of what they do, or a lot of athletes do, and they know it's the last session of the week. So they're actually prepared to put a bit more out. And then they then got, like, I don't know, 38, 40 hours to actually adapt. And there's some evidence saying you adapt best to your last session. So they got actually a lot of time to adapt to that stimulus. So I think that works quite well. So I think, well, I guess my answer is that I think the way the program's put together works well. I always remember the first year I was at the NCC, so I'm 2016-17, and we were training out. I always remember this. So we were training out a health club in Penrith, and because our building hadn't been built at that stage, and the girls were like, maybe he had a really heavy block. It was maybe 3 hard weeks in a row, and they were right at the end of it. And they were, I remember the session, we were lifting Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the session on a Wednesday, the girls were really struggling and in a bad way. They were pretty down and tired. And then on that Friday, we were going for weights. So I remember driving out to Penrith thinking, oh, geez, I don't know how this is going to go today. They were supposed to row, weights, row. And after the morning row, the coach said, oh, we're not going to do this the afternoon row. And the girls did PB, so many PBs in a session. So it just makes you realise how much there's a psychological component in there, because they're all still fatigued, they're all knackered, but just the belief that, oh, I'm going to get the afternoon off, all of a sudden their attitude and what they were capable of doing changed. So I thought, I remember that and thought it's kind of fascinating. Yeah. So, any questions online? Have we got some? No.
Any more questions in here? Okay, well, I'd like to thank, I mean, this is one of those things we can talk about forever. There's always so much interest in it, and you know, ways we do things, why we don't. Talk about John's program. I went out with John when we were up in Rockhampton before we came up to Tokyo, and I'd been clearing out my locker at home, and I found some programs from Jürgen, what we're doing back in the UK. 25 years old program. I looked at John's, still the same.
Probably top of it.
Yeah, well, he did say that. Oh, yeah, why change it? But what he did say was that the thing that's changed between over that 25 years is our knowledge of nutrition, and so our knowledge of nutrition has allowed those guys to actually back up and do those additional sessions. Whereas beforehand, you know, especially as a lightweight, you know, our way of making weight was to starve or dehydrate, which, you know, all those years ago was the way everyone did it. But now with our knowledge of nutrition and everything else, it allows us to train harder and do the stuff that you're putting through now, which they may not be able to do to the same benefit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And we're very fortunate at the centre with the setup you've seen it, the setup we've got. And that's actually been a real driver. But right from the start is around nutrition, and I think that's really helped some of the strength and power gains we've had, and lean muscle mass gains we've had in the girls over the years.
No more questions? All right, I'd just like to thank Dave for his knowledge and insights in the
No worries. Thank you. Cool. Cheers.
Well, we need to let these young girls come up and have their dinner, because they've been sitting downstairs in the boat shed.
It's online.
All right. Guys, you want to